Ozadomi is a Japanese illustrator who draws and designs many characters, often including animal-inspired themes. How these themes, as well as color and lighting, is used in Ozadomi's illustrations is really fascinating to me, so I wanted to analyze the art style, and in today's video I'll share my experience of doing this. Hi, here's May. Over the past months I've studied several artists to help me improve and develop in my art, and I'm happy to be able to share this with you. For the analysis today, I mention how Ozadomi draws different elements in their art, and I'll share my own application of these elements along the way. I find combining both the analysis part with the application part helps me to really understand the artist I'm studying. For now, let's start with the first element, the lines. Here, Ozadomi uses varying line thickness. A lot of the lines are painted over. The clearest, thickest lines tend to be around the face, eyes, hair, and silhouette of the character. Some lines will be more sketchy. You have a transition of color into line art and not a clear separation here most of the time. Often, Ozadomi also uses no line art and focuses on shapes instead. For the lines, Ozadomi mostly uses colored lines, which often have a reddish, darker, saturated color compared to the base color. Next, let's move on to the bodies. For young-looking characters, bigger heads with smaller bodies will be used. The characters here tend to have thin, rather childlike proportions, meaning they're not very muscular and have more straight limbs. This, like I said, is due to the characters Ozadomi draws being rather young. You can see that when Ozadomi draws older characters, they use different proportions here. Most characters Ozadomi draws tend to be 6 heads tall. Overall, the characters would be around 8 heads tall. The proportions Ozadomi uses can be described as kinda boxy or square. The shoulders, waist, and hips width are not too different from each other. The hips tend to be rather wide overall. Ozadomi draws rather thin necks. The arms and legs are pretty straight and only slightly curved and tapered. Tapering means that the limbs get thinner towards the joint. For example, for the upper leg, that at the hip the leg is wider while it's getting thinner towards the knee. As part of my analysis, similarly to my other art style analysis videos, I drew a basic body where I applied what I discovered when studying the different elements in Ozadomi's art. I would describe the bodies as thin, elegant, and cute. The hands also are rather elegant and thin. Often the knuckles are portrayed through shading here. Next, let's move on to the face. The face shape is mostly rounded. Ozadomi draws a more pointy chin and rounded jaws and cheeks. The change of direction from the cheek downwards to the chin inwards is at around the mouth level. For side views it will be a bit higher up. The faces appear rather cute and young because of the full rounded cheeks and jaw, but the side of the cheek is usually not too puffy and rather flat. The cheek corner is pretty wide at around the outer eye end, leading to wider faces overall. At times the cheek corner also disappears and you have a fully rounded outline instead. To me, the lower half of face seems kind of wide, voluminous, and big. For drawing angles from below, no outline will usually be used. Instead, you have some shading to separate the face from the neck. Next, let's move on to the features of the face, starting with the nose. For the front view, you tend to have a dot or one line. For the three-quarter view, you also often have 2 changes of direction and small lines at the end of the nose. Sometimes a nostril will be added as well. The nose lines are often only drawn in at the bottom of the nose. The nose appears very small overall. Usually a shadow is added on the nose. In a few cases there will also be some light on the nose. After the nose we move on to the mouth. This is usually portrayed as just a line. Sometimes a small line or shadow is added below the mouth to portray the chin. Open mouths tend to not be too wide or big. Incomplete lines are also often used. For a closed mouth, the middle tends to be empty often. For a few illustrations, a slight shadow on the lips, on the lower lip mostly, is added. Open mouths can be shaded as well. There will often be a shadow on the inside part of the mouth and even the teeth. Here the characters look cuter due to their small mouths. Now, after we've talked about the mouth, let's move on to the eyebrows. These are rather thin and a bit curved. They appear small and gentle and are not angled downwards usually. For some expressions, Ozadomi also uses asymmetry here. Now let's talk about a part that makes every artist very unique: the eyes. First, I am focusing on the outlines and shapes of the eye. This is what you would focus on during the sketching and line art phase. The eye shape is a bit rectangular. I would describe it as tall and wide open, sometimes being a bit rounded. Next, let's talk about the lines and lashes that are used to portray the eye. Overall, this would basically be a rectangle for which the inner side is empty. For the upper side, you have a thick eyelash. You can have multiple lashes added for this upper eyelash as well. One big lash always be at the outer edge, and more smaller ones can be added usually at the inner corner or outer corner and along the eye. The eyelashes appear sharp, pointy, triangular, and not very curved. For the outer side you have a thinner eyelash. Here you usually have no additional lashes. The upper side will be thicker than the lower one here. This and other parts of the eye will also have a red line or coloring added at times. Finally, for the lower side you have a very thin or almost no eyelash. Often many small triangular lashes are added, which can sometimes be black, sometimes they're skin colored and just outlined. All angles and lines of the eye are sometimes more and sometimes less curved. Then you can also have a shading of the eyelash, where inner parts appear lighter, and this as well as additional lines on the lash, can add more 3D-ness and detail next for lines around the eye. You have one long line above the eyelash. Sometimes this is just following the eye shape. Sometimes this includes more than one direction and overlapping lines as well as different line thickness. Next, let's move on to the iris and pupil. First of all, the iris has a circular rounded shape that's also rather long and a bit flat. The iris looks like a full circle, while the shading of it can vary a bit from illustration to illustration. Here is one method I figured out to draw the iris like Ozadomi. First we have the base layer, next would be a shadow layer on which shadows are drawn in around the iris and under the eyelash. After this we'd have a bright overlay layer, which tends to be warm for cold eyes at the bottom of the iris. And finally we'd have a detail layer on which either a circle, strokes or colorful overlays can be added. Another thing to note here is that the shading can be slightly different for both irises and eyes. And for the pupil, this can vary as well. Usually it's a longer thin shape that is rather small. It can appear owl, eagle or more generally animal-like. Often the pupil is kind of transitioning into the iris. To make the eyes look more alive, adding highlights is important. The placement, size and amount of them can be a bit different for each illustration. Most often a highlight is right above the iris. Sometimes highlights that go from the white of the eye into the iris are added as well. Other highlights around the eyes are placed on the lashes. They kinda outline them, making them look more 3D-ish. And finally, for the white of the eye, a regular shadow that's cast from the eyelash is used. In a few illustrations, shading at the bottom of the eye around the iris is added. Now we're done with the eyes, let's move on to the face shading next. Often a shadow at the upper eyelid line is added. Some blush or red parts around the eye, especially for the outer side, can be added in as well. Under the eyebrows, some shading is sometimes added in as well, separating the forehead from the part in between the eyes and the eyebrows. And other than that, some blush under the eyes and on the nose sometimes as well is added. In a few cases, the overall shading is kind of textured. It can also include some lines. Now we're moving on to another aspect that can be very unique to each artist, the hair. The hairline art focuses on silhouettes but also portrays some strands. Often these lines are painted over, just like with the general line art, and the hairline art transitions into the hair shapes. The hairlines are not always rounded, sometimes they appear a bit more straight or shapy. Ozadomi uses sketchy lines generally. Here lots of flowiness or 3D-ness through changes of direction can be added. The hair often looks like it's in motion. Ozadomi often makes the hair strands look more 3D by drawing them like ribbons and sometimes also simplifying multiple strands into shapes. Many small strands are also added in at times as well. There is not that much of a clear separation for the hairline art and the shading, what I'll move on to now. For shading the hair, Ozadomi tends to use a base color and a base color that is in shadow. The shape for this is often just one rounded line around the head, but for some illustrations, shapes can be used as well. What stands out here would be that a glow around the shadow edge is often painted in, then multiple levels of shading are added, including very dark shadows at the hair origin, some dark shadows separating the front and back hair strand parts, some smaller zigzag or triangular shapes as well to add detail and small lines to give the hair more texture. A few of the edges here have color or a darker outline. The strands are separated but also kinda transitioning into one another. Like this, the hair is made up of many shapely strands. Layers I would use to create a hair shading result similar to Ozadomi would be first the base color, next would be a layer for the shadows, then another layer for darker shadows, a layer for details as well as sometimes small hairlines, and finally we'd have a layer for the highlights. Speaking of which, let's talk about how Ozadomi draws these next. The highlights tend to follow the head sphere and are mostly white small shapes. Usually not too much contrast is used here. They're not too apparent, there also are not always highlights on the hair. They tend to be made up of zigzaggy, blocky, messy shapes or small lines that are placed above the forehead pretty high up. Finally, for hair that's over the eyes and eyebrows, usually the eyes and eyebrows are still visible underneath, but parts of these features can also be slightly covered. Next, we move on to talking about the clothes. For portraying these mostly rather few, more sketchy lines, or also no lines are used. Many shapes are painted in here. Usually folds are indicated through shading only. Ozadomi uses lots of painterly shapes. The clothes are drawn with many soft edges and you have a separation of parts through different shapes, textures and values. Characteristic here is that a lot of the outfit parts include feathers or fur. A lot of them, especially the patterns on them, are animal inspired. In these cases especially, no lines but rather painterly shapes and textures are used, for example for feathers. To achieve this look, I think some paintbrush texture is used. It seems like Ozadomi uses brushes with specific textures that, for example, have multiple strokes. The outfits Ozadomi draws tend to be very detailed, including many overlapping and usually oversized parts and capes. While the designs are detailed, the clothes themselves are not too rendered in a detailed way, which helps to not overwhelm the viewer and draw attention to the less busy-looking, not as textured face. To make the colors of the clothes stand out, Ozadomi also uses some hue variation and subsurface scattering sometimes. Speaking of colors, let's talk about what colors Ozadomi tends to use. For colors, they tend to be pretty saturated with heavy contrasts. Orange or blue is often used as dominant color. Many illustrations will have a dominant color that can usually be found within the hair and outfit. The eye color is either harmonious or contrasting to this. The dominant color in the illustration can often also be found in the lighting. Speaking of lighting, this tends to define the colors in the overall illustration a lot, and it's what I'll talk about next. The shading and lighting here usually adds a lot of contrast. The colors for the parts in shadow are pretty different from the ones in light, at least value, but often also color-wise. In some cases, both warm light and shadow, but in many warm light and cool shadows is used. What also stood out to me here is the contrast of saturation in this illustration for parts in light and parts in shadow. Some hue variation and reflected lights, especially to add cool parts to warm parts in shadow, such as the reflected light on the arms in this illustration here, are used as well sometimes. You can really see the color variety on the gray outfit parts, for example. Other than this, a saturated border, especially for harsher shadows or the one big multiply base shadow, is used often as well. The saturation of the shadows can vary from lighting scenario or the scene here. To paint in the shadows, here are the layers I would use to do this. First, I'd start with a base, then I would add the first shadow with a multiply layer depending on the lighting direction, intensity, and color change. How this looks can vary. After this, I would add painterly darker cast and texture shadows, and finally very dark shadows for a few areas. Like this, you would have around 4 levels of shading, parts in light, parts in the base shadow, texture shadows, which can also just add some hue variations, or instead be reflected light. Overall, the colors for these will either be lighter or darker than the base, and finally, the darkest shadow. Ozadomis shadows tend to generally have a textured look. As mentioned before, I would imagine a textured brush would likely be used here. The shadows are not clean shapes, you have varying intensity within the shadow. Often the shadows are made up of multiple strokes and not just one shape. Other than that, the shading or lighting will often also include smaller shapes. Usually not too sharp shapes, rounded edges are used. Ozadomi also often adds small parts with a lot of saturation or some reflected lights here. Finally, let's move on to the extra effects. What stands out? Here I would first mention that it often looks like a watercolor or other texture is painted in over everything. At times, Ozadomi also adds small particles which look painterly. Other than the thematically fitting elements such as small feathers, flowing or flying parts as well as sparkles are also added at times. These are often out of focus. Blurring parts that are out of focus is something Ozadomi often makes use of. Next, let's talk about the backgrounds Ozadomi uses. This can either be just a flat color on which a shadow or pattern is added at times, or in other cases it can be full-on painted scenes or skies which can look very dreamy. Here thinner or no lines are used. It looks very believable overall. The use of thicker, cleaner lines around the character only really draws attention to them here. Ozadomi also likes to add props fitting to the scene, which are also portrayed with no or only rough outlines. Since a lot of the illustrations Ozadomi draws are animal-themed, animals are another commonly added element in the illustrations. These look pretty realistic, painterly and cute, fitting to the character. To me it seems like Ozadomi is fascinated and inspired by animals and studied them by using them as reference and inspiration. Ozadomi's characters often are also kind of personified animals. Their designs are inspired by the animal, especially including their fur or feathers as pattern. And in general, almost all characters have some kind of animal ears and pointy nails, things that suggest that they're animal inspired. Now we're done with talking about the different elements. Next I drew an illustration of my OC Yumari using what I learned during my analysis. I started with the sketch drawing him from a front on perspective. I wanted the head and shoulder angles to be different from each other to make the pose more interesting. I started with sketching in the head. When the face is viewed from the front, I always struggle with the symmetry. For one, having the head be completely symmetrical looks unnatural, but at the same time it should have around the same volume on both sides. Then I sketched in the hair. Here I wanted to add a lot of motion by making it look like it's in the wind. I tried out a bunch of variations for Yumari's longer hair strand on the right side of the illustration. Then I moved onto the body and added in a hand. After this I sketched in Yumari's outfit and a small bird. Like this, and by adjusting the outfit, adding in feathers at the shoulders, at the sleeves and on the head, as well as these many hanging accessoires from the shirt part wrapping around his shoulders, I wanted to make this fit more to Ozadomis illustrations. I also added some face paint and the necklace here. Then it was time for Leonard, which went pretty smoothly for the face and hair. I wanted to keep this more loose and not too clean. For the outfit parts around Yumari's shoulder, I at first just drew straight connections between them, but I realized this wouldn't make a lot of sense, so I drew over this to connect them differently. Especially for the feathers or the animals, I noticed how Ozadomi often doesn't use lines but rather shapes, making these parts more painterly and rough so that more attention is drawn to the clearer Leonard around the face and hair. Due to this, I didn't want to use as many lines here because I would likely paint over them later on. Next, I filled in the flat colors, going off of Humorous palette. I didn't change this up a lot, because for Ozadomis art, the lighting and shading, what I'll talk about next, will affect this a lot. Before I started shading, I determined the different colors I would use for the shading layers of each color. I painted in a few different lighting scenarios on a multiply layer over everything to first determine where the lighting should be coming from and what shadow shapes it would create. For this, I wanted to make sure there would be some contrast on the face, especially to draw more attention to it. I decided to go for a light from the top right in the end to determine what lighting scenario I would like to go for. I often make all my variations black and white and check which version I like most value-wise. What frames the character best is clear and creates nice shadow shapes. I refined my basic multiply layer for a bit, then I started with shading the skin, especially working on the hands and defining the knuckles was challenging to me here. To change the color of the basic multiply layer over everything for the skin, I select the skin color layer and then apply a hue saturation value filter mask. Often I like to make the color for the skin shadows a bit warmer here. Next I shaded the eyes. The most colorful part when it comes to the illustration, including a lot of colors here, draws attention to them, and I went with kind of a sunset color scheme at the bottom of Humorous eyes for this. For shading the hair, I started with the bigger shadows using a warmer shadow color, then I added in darker shadows with a cooler tone. After this, I then added in these small texture hair strands. This is something I'm not used to, but I like the look of it and may possibly include this in some of my future illustrations. I struggled a bit with defining the shadow border for the transition of the bigger parts in shadow to the parts in light. I experimented with the shapes here. For this, I also added a shadow border. After this, I moved on to the clothes, adding in the multiple shadow colors on different layers to achieve more of a painterly look. I find blurring some borders and creating transitions between the colors helps. I wanted to make the stone material or the feathers look different from the clothes by shading each of these elements a bit differently. Especially shading the feathers was rather challenging here, since I don't have much experience with this. I also realized this even more when painting the bird. I used references, but still the shape and how the feathers should look. These were aspects that took some time to work on for me. To kind of help with this, I also painted the bird from one of Ozadomis illustrations with acrylic paint on black paper, while getting the right colors this way can be more challenging. Since you have to mix colors yourself while not having a color picker like you have digitally, I found this good for getting a nice texture for the feathers. Using traditional brushes and acrylic paint worked out nicely for this small study I did. As preparation for this illustration, I can recommend it. After I had shaded everything, I moved on to painting over some parts, mostly the lines. I also added a few hair strands this way. Finally, it was time to add in the background. For this, I at first had the idea of painting in some curtains. I wanted them to flow in the wind. I also added small particles using dynamic lines, adding dynamicness through flowy elements such as the hair, the composition of the background, or small particles like these here is something I find really inspiring in Ozadomis art, and I enjoyed doing this a lot. Then I also experimented with some more background ideas. I tried adding twigs, trees, a sky and a window. In the end, I went with the window with a small moon at the top right corner here, fitting to Yumari being the moon guardian in his world. I was unsure about adding the curtains back in, but decided not to go with it since it seemed too overwhelming to me. As I was painting in and adjusting the background, I often would check the contrast and values in the image. I was thinking about either making the background very bright or rather dark, and to make my rather bright character with light hair and a light outfit stand out more, I went with a dark background here in the end. That's it for drawing my OC Yumari in Ozadomis style. Next, I mentioned some of the differences I noticed when comparing my art to Ozadomis. First, we have the textures of the clothes and especially the feathers. Since I'm not that experienced with drawing these materials with shading similarly to Ozadomi, it makes sense that this looks different. Ozadomi has a lot of experience and knowledge when it comes to drawing feathers or fur, for example. Next would be that the eyes and hair look too clean or kind of clear in my art. My illustration looks less painterly and soft in my opinion, partly because the lines and the colors are more separated than for Ozadomis art. Painting over some more lines could help with this. Another aspect I'm not too sure about, but it is kind of different to me, would be the palette of the outfit. It looks kind of too pastel-y. Ozadomi tends to either go for more saturated or darker colors for this usually. And the final point I mention here is that my bird, or in general animal drawing skills, definitely aren't as good as Ozadomis. My bird doesn't look how Ozadomi would draw it. It looks less accurate and nice to me. After the differences, let's move on to my learnings next. First, I would mention the importance of textures in paintings. It can bring attention to the face and make outfits and parts in the illustration look more interesting. A lot of depth can be added to the shadows this way as well. Next would be the relevance of lighting and contrast. Ozadomi draws in light and shadows, especially on the face, which draws attention to it again. Then I would also add the small particles Ozadomi adds to this at times. And finally, we have using inspirations such as animals to add background elements, patterns, and come up with character designs or compositions. That's it for my style analysis of Ozadomi. I hope it was inspiring and helpful to you. I can only recommend checking out Ozadomis art. Links to it are in the video description. Ozadomi is also working as a character designer for the game Evil Prince and the Puppet. I came across the Instagram account for this game in 2022 and loved seeing the illustrations and the world as well as the characters. All of it is fascinating and beautiful to me. I look forward to seeing more about it and how this develops in the future. I can only recommend checking it out. Links to it are in the video description. If you're interested in seeing the full screen recorded process of the basic body and head from this video and you would like to support me, you can check out my Patreon. I'm very grateful for being able to analyze amazing artists like Ozadomi and learning from this. Thank you for watching and have a nice day. Bye.